Hey everyone, welcome back to the SOMM TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. Today's episode is pretty cool. I have a living legend on the pod today. His name is Hugh Johnson, and if you haven't heard of him, I'm surprised if you're in wine, but if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Hugh Johnson is behind probably one of the most important wine books ever written, which is the World Atlas of Wine, and he has written many, many, many other things. I mean, probably a lot of you have a lot of his books on your shelf. He's a really interesting guy and has had a normal person. He's lived 50 of their lives in wine. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of things, but namely some of the craziest bottles he's ever had, during the course of his career. The oldest, the most special, a lot of memories, including a 1540 German Stein wine. Think about that. A 1540 wine that he opened and drank. And his stories around it are just incredible. So him and I are going to get into it. He is royalty in the wine world. And today's episode is brought to you by Eldon Selections. Eldon Selections is an online Burgundy-only wine retailer. It's the largest of its kind in the United States. I know you listening to this know it is really hard to find Burgundy that is unique and let alone you can afford. Eldon Selections has created the first ever Burgundy-only wine club, and they ship red and white, Pinot and Chardonnay wines from very small producers that they know and work with over a course of many years to be able to get these allocations. If you're looking for wine that is from this region that you can't get anywhere else, Eldon Selections is the only place to do it. Please go to burgundywine.com/SOMM. This is the place to go if you're looking for very small production, very boutique, and hard to get Burgundies at a price you can actually afford. There just isn't a lot of this stuff left. burgundywine.com/SOMM. Without further ado, we speak with Hugh Johnson, wine royalty. Hugh, it's an incredible honor to have you on the podcast. I have to say, I think a lot of people listening to this podcast have read many of your books, and if they haven't, they absolutely should. We know many, many people in common in the wine business. I also want to say before we get started, we do edit the podcast, so I know you swear a lot, so I'm happy we can...
I'll take your lead on swearing.
Okay. Being in the wine, I don't know what you would call it, business, industry, just the world of wine for so long, how does one introduce you?
Oh, well, a lot of people say the author of the World Atlas of Wine and lots of other books, that kind of thing.
Right.
But most recently, I've become less of a geographer and more of a historian. That's the way I've gone.
Right. Is that because you're looking back or you love history?
I've loved history more and more. It's in my family. My father was a historian. It has more and more significance. I suppose as one gets one's own history too. When you're old enough, you've got a history.
This is true.
But what I've never been is a wine critic. I've never, let alone scoring wine. I just don't do that. And I don't know how. But no, I'm a commentator. I'm a facilitator. I'm what the French call a vulgarizer.
A vulgarizer.
A vulgarisateur. And I go along with that.
I've never heard that term. So is that because you make it more accessible or you're literally just swearing about wine?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Like, the Vulgate was the first translation of the Bible from Latin.
That's right.
Vulgate means to the vulgar people. So that's me.
Love it. Aside from your writing, how can you be this long in the business and not consider yourself or be able to be a critic? You have to have opinions about wine and you have to clearly influence what people buy when you write things, right?
Well, I would say, honestly, only in a generalized way. I very rarely home in. I'll home in on a vintage or a producer, but I think I've very rarely taken a bottle and described it, let alone given it a rating. I give wine its context, really.
Makes sense. The concept of a proper wine critic as a thing, I kind of look at that as maybe not an English invention, but certainly it has been standardized by the English, right?
Well, by my friend Michael Broadbent, who wrote the book on it.
Of course.
His book, Wine Tasting, is the basis of every critic's sort of analytical approach to wine.
How do you feel about wine criticism?
I think it's overdone. I think a lot of critics start with a sort of suspicious mind. They think that everyone's got a scam up his sleeve. I think it was Robert Parker who referred to Ralph Nader, going for actually what the government did in not controlling the motor car industry and allowing dangerous cars to go on the road. So it started from the sort of downside of, anyone who can sell you a pup is going to do so. It's, in a way, to me, it's a kind of American attitude. In Britain, we're much more trusting. We think, if this chap's prepared to give a recommendation and he says he likes it, or why should I think that he's trying to scam me? And I've just found that things are changing. Nowadays, the scoring system has ironed that out a bit, but I still find that there's a sort of suspicion over any product, really. And I think we in Britain are very welcoming. We like new ideas. We want to give them a try, and we don't think, he's just riding on a famous name or something. It happens. It obviously happened, but more in France than in England. If you go to a French supermarket and you see these terrible wines riding on an Appellation Contrôlée sometimes at suspiciously low prices, but the French are prepared to buy and drink no matter what, in my opinion.
I think you're correct. It is an American thing to be suspicious. There's also a grander competition with Americans overall, but also especially in wine. It's like you have to win. It's like a competition. Whereas I do find in my limited time, maybe 10 or so trips to England, that it's not the same case. It just isn't. There's not this, I have to be the best, attitude of everything.
No, there isn't. And I want the best and I want it now. That is very, very American in my view.
Yeah, so I happen to agree with that. I like that attitude. I want it now. No, I'm just kidding. But I also think, in some ways, that helps move things quicker, but not always for the better. Yeah. I don't know that I'm the right person to put, here we have an American guy and a very esteemed British guy talking about the concept of criticism in wine. I guess what I think is interesting is that you, and I know Jancis says this a lot, try to stay impartial with your writing. Jancis Robinson tells me all the time, she goes, I'm not in the wine business. I've never been a part of the wine business. And I always find that funny because it's clearly you guys are in the wine business.
Yes, it takes up a lot of our thoughts and time, and we're always trying new things. But I never try to hide you can call them prejudices, you can call them tastes. But, I'm a great lover of what we call claret, of red Bordeaux. Stephen Spurrier was just the same. He said, one always goes back to claret. That set a standard of something which was an ideal mealtime drink. It has a balance, it has a freshness, it refreshes you, it has character, it is recognizable, it's very easy to find. Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere. There's so much of it. It has so many advantages. Okay, I'm not prejudiced from it. I've got reasons for using an awful lot of it.
There you go. I like that. There's a couple other things I want to talk about. How many years have you been in the wine industry or the wine business?
Well, the first article I wrote, which was published, was in the Christmas issue of Vogue magazine in 1960. So
wow, okay.
How many years ago is that? 60 years ago? Yeah, 60 years.
That's quite a long time. So I would imagine over the course of 60 odd years, you have had hundreds of thousands of wines that you have tasted and that you've enjoyed. What I want to do is I want to talk about maybe 5 or 6 that stick out in your brain and why. Individual bottles. I've read that you drank a wine in the 60s from 1540, a German wine, a Stein wine.
1540, that's quite true. Yep, it was a Stein wine from Bavaria.
I've never heard of a wine still in a liquid form at that age. Can you tell me the story of this 1540 wine and how you got to drink it? What was it like? It's just, that's a once in a 80 lifetime experience.
Oh, yes, no question. I was incredibly lucky. I was only in my early 20s at the time, but I was a wine correspondent and I was invited to this tasting in London with about a dozen other people. And it was put on by a German wine merchant. And he had traced this bottle because the King of Bavaria, who was often known as Mad King Ludwig, poor King Ludwig of Bavaria, one thing he was mad about was wine. And he collected it and he discovered that in Würzburg, the capital of northern Bavaria, there was a cache of a few bottles of this 16th century wine, which, just to put it in context, it would have been quite an old wine when Shakespeare was born. And he collected this wine, and then at some point, mysteriously, the remains of his cellar in the Bavarian castle was auctioned. And this wine merchant was smart enough to buy 2 bottles of the 1540. And 1 bottle is still left in the city of Würzburg. I've seen it sitting in the cellar. I don't think it'll ever be opened, but the one that came to London was opened with some ceremony, and we had no idea whether it would be drinkable. And the miracle is that it was not just drinkable, it was actually for a moment, really, it was wine. It was sweet and enjoyable, and it felt a bit straight away. The second sip was almost vinegar. It was extraordinary. And it was Maderized as far as a wine can be Maderized. It was brown, but there was a sort of fragrance about it that suggested Germany. And I think it's very, very hard to explain. But the reason the bottle was there was because it was 1540 was one of the great drought years, and they say that the River Rhine dried up and they couldn't get water. So when there was a great vintage, the habit in Germany was to build a special barrel, and they built this not very big barrel in the cellars of the royal residence in Würzburg. There were much bigger barrels, but this was, I don't know, not even a small swimming pool. And they kept the wine in the barrel because there was nowhere else to keep it. They didn't have bottles, they didn't have corks in those days. Obviously, the level in the barrel went down, either by evaporation or because they wanted to taste it once in a while. So their reaction to the level going down was to top up the wine either with another very great sweet wine or to drop stones in the barrel to bring the level up. But that wine...
Stones, okay?
Yeah, well, pebbles of the river. So this wine was still in this barrel when it was early in the 18th century, when it was already 240 years old, something like that. And they had the great idea of actually using bottles. Bottles were a new idea. The corkscrew had only just been invented. Otherwise, how did you get the cork out? And so this bottle was bottled and stashed away as a great rarity. And that's how we know, well, that is its history, really. How long it was in barrel, how long it was in bottle. It preserved it. But to me, the magic thing, the extraordinary thing, was that I actually consumed a food, if you like, that was ripened by the sun 200 and something years before. It was the energy of the sunshine of that vintage that was still keeping it alive and which I swallowed. Now that to me is something absolutely extraordinary. There is no other food stuff. There's nothing else in the world you could do that with.
It's an incredible thing to think what has happened in the world since 1540. Yeah. All the modern wars, all the shaping of the countries that we inhabit, and also just the things that have happened in Germany over the last 100 years, 150 years, that this bottle could have even survived in any capacity is mind-boggling.
It is, including the creation of Germany as an entity.
That's right.
That only goes back less than 200 years.
1870, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Really quick on this bottle of wine. I have a few more questions. So it was a fortified sweet wine, right? Type of a thing? Is that?
It wasn't fortified. No, there was nothing to fortify it with. They didn't have distilled spirits. It was just super sweet.
Ah, okay. Do you think that that is part of what allowed it to survive for nearly 500 years? I mean,
no question. It was the intensity of sugar. They didn't analyze it, but it was rather like Tokai Essentia. Is a bit like that. It would be even sweeter because the Greek grapes are shriveled. It was somewhere in that direction, I would say.
Interesting. Take Tokai as an example, because there aren't a lot of modern wines done to that sweetness level right now due to taste and things. No. Do you think Tokai could go 500 years?
It certainly wouldn't improve. The oldest Tokai I've had was from the late 18th century. Undated.
Wow, 1700s.
This comes from the Habsburg cellar in Vienna. The emperors of Austria had this great cellar. And I've had 2 dated bottles from 1850 of this Tokai.
Incredible.
It's very strange. It goes completely black, but it doesn't spoil.
That's right.
Yes.
I've had some very, very old Yquem, Chateau Latour, and it's similar where you see it go very, very dark in color. Last couple questions on this bottle. So was there a cork? Was the cork in shape? Had it been recorked? I'm just so curious how it even held up.
Well, so am I. But there was no evidence it had been recorked. The cork had held up somehow. And corks were tiny in those days. They didn't have great long ones.
Basically, you poured it, you got one sip, and then it oxidized immediately and turned into...
Oh, it already was super oxidized, maderized, but its sort of structure gave up. I'd love to have had it analyzed, but nobody thought of that. Nobody thought it would be interesting even. What the acidity, it must have had high acidity to survive. But above all, it was sugar.
Yeah.
It was sugar.
All right. So you're a young man. You have that wine. Now, where do you go from there? I mean, I want to talk through a few more bottles you've had in your career and kind of really special ones for various reasons. A 1540 German wine, which I assume would have probably been Riesling. It would have been, what would it have been, grape-wise?
No, it was before they started planting Riesling.
Okay.
What they plant in that vineyard now is Silvaner. All vineyards in those days were planted with a mixture. The idea of a single variety vineyard just didn't come up. The farmers planted the best vines they'd got. They may not have even known their names, but it was an insurance policy to have a mixture.
So it would have been a field blend type thing.
A field blend, exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Even white and red. It could have been different grapes completely.
Oh, it could. Yes.
Okay. So what else bottle-wise? I have maybe 5 or 6 in my life, but they are nothing in comparison to the wines that you've had. And maybe they're not so much pomp and circumstance, but I'm just curious, somebody like you, what's another bottle that you had that just sticks with you?
Well, antiquity is not everything. I do remember at a tasting in Dallas, Texas, many years ago. Michael Broadbent and I were there together. As usual, it was a doctor who They had collected the wines and gave the tasting. And we had Chateau Latour going back to the very end of the 18th century. I think the oldest wine was 1798 Lafite.
Wow.
The best wine was the 1825, and it just knocked our socks off. And the following morning, I think Michael and I were staying with our host, Marvin Overton, and we came down at breakfast and to look at the empty decanters and to sniff them, thinking by that time all the old wines would be rubbish. And we came to the 1825 Lafite, and we drank it for breakfast. It was just beautiful. Absolutely stunning. I'll always remember that bottle.
Wow. So overnight, I mean, I've seen this happen with some younger Bordeaux's and younger Chiantis and such, where the next day it's better than it was the night. Even sometimes things that you thought were not good turn out to be fantastic. But I've never heard of an 1825 being able to hold. I mean, that's unbelievable.
With Chateau Yquem, you can confidently go back a very long way. I think one of the greatest Yquems was the 1847. If anybody's got some, do ask me round.
Is that the Comet vintage?
No, that was the 1811, I think.
Okay.
And that's still good to drink. But I was asked, I mean, I had a long association with Chateau Latour in Bordeaux because I was on the board of directors for a while. And at one point, the new owner, a Frenchman, Francois Pinault, who bought it from the British company, who'd owned it for a while, that's why I was on the board, he very kindly gave me a lunch at the chateau. And he said, "What are your favourite vintages of Latour?" And I thought, what? Can I really tell him? And I said 1959 and 1949. I think they were two fabulous vintages. And he said, "Okay, that's what we'll drink." we had about 40 guests.
Wow.
It was a very generous gesture.
Wow.
Very generous.
Have you had anything that was unexpected? I mean, something maybe not from France, maybe something that really, really, really took you very by surprise. A bottle you had in a situation.
Yes, in Australia, I've had what we now call blockbusters, which were then just the best they could do. But there was an old Hermitage, as they called it, which is a Syrah or Shiraz from Rutherglen, which is a very hot region on the borders of New South Wales and Victoria. I always remember its label because it said in black label and in red letters across it, it said Hermitage. And I said, that should read danger.
Right. Yeah.
It was a sort of 50-year-old wine, and it was just impossible to forget the richness and depth of that. So, keep your hopes up. You'll always come across something absolutely, really startlingly good in an unexpected place. And there are moments of excitement which are unexpected. I always remember when New Zealand wine first came to England, which would have been the early 1980s, I guess. Mm-hmm. They had a tasting for journalists in New Zealand House. And we went there thinking, well, we know that New Zealand isn't really a wine country. And they lined up some Chardonnays and Sauvignon Blanc, and we went down the line and we looked at each other and said, good heavens, this is just wow, blimey, as we say. We're drinking really, really good wine. Although we didn't know it existed. So there are exciting moments like that.
I'm sure the New Zealanders would love to hear that the bar was so low you couldn't believe it was just good wine. That's pretty funny. Yeah. Keep going. Give me one more bottle, one more story that you can remember.
Well, there are really famous and precious wines like the 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc, the 1945 Mouton Rothschild, which have built up such reputations that their prices are out of sight. I mean, they're real collector's wines. And I have tasted those, and they do teach one just how off the chart wonderful great wine can be. You're just left gasping in amazement that it can seem like a great work of art. It can be moving as well as delicious. I dare say I could rake up a few more amazing memories like that. But also champagne. I was once lucky enough at Christie's auctions to buy a whole dozen case of the Perrier-Jouet 1911, which was known to be a very good year.
Wow.
And I gave it to a dinner party of real wine lovers who knew what they were doing. And to a man, we said, we've never tasted champagne better than this.
1911, did it still have any effervescence, or was it flat still?
No, you couldn't call it flat. You couldn't call it sparkling either. It was that lively prickle that makes it really alive in your mouth. It was utterly delicious. But you see, in all these references to really great, fascinating wines, age is so important. I couldn't possibly say, well, I had the Petrus 2010 or something. It was a really great wine because it wasn't. It just wasn't old enough. I think people have to factor in age into their assessment of how great wine could be.
I don't think a lot of Americans, and I don't mean to pigeonhole my entire country because it's not everybody, but aging wine is not something that is part of our culture. It's unfortunately not. I wish it was, because I think people think you have to be wealthy or rich to have a wine collection. I disagree with this. I think you just have to have the right space and and you have to look towards time. You don't buy a cellar all at once. No. You collect it over time. And that's what I think Americans don't get. They think you have to build.
It's more and more expensive to do. I mean, the best California wines I think I've ever had probably were Napa Cabernets from producers like BV, like Louis Martini of the 1950s, early 50s, from collector cellars around the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And they hadn't paid a lot for those wines. The first person to ever charge more than $1 or $2 was Joe Heights Cellars. And he suddenly said, this wine of mine is worth 4 times as much as Smear BV, and he put that price on it, and guess what? He sold 4 times as much.
You know, we're filming something on the Judgment of Paris right now, and Joe, obviously Heights, Martha's Vineyard, was in it. And I know that Joe Heights was not known as the gentlest person. He was very competitive, very, very, very bombastic. You know, I think that everyone can say something that he was mad at them at one point. You know, anyone who knew him can say, this man lost his temper at me. I heard a story one time about the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas, that somebody came up with the idea to put truffle oil on fries. And they charged the same amount of money as regular fries that they had at the Bellagio at a nice restaurant. So if you wanted to order French fries and you wanted them with truffle oil on them, they were the same price. Yeah. And they couldn't sell the truffle oil fries at all. Nobody wanted them. And so they got this crazy idea to charge twice as much for the truffle fries. They just charged twice as much. Yeah. And they could not keep them in stock. That was the only difference, is they charged more. So I'm not saying Joe Heights' wine wasn't better than BV. I'm saying I doubt it was 4 times better than BV.
You know, there was a distinctive difference, and that is that Joe believed in French oak. In fact, he bought wines already made by Hanzel in Sonoma, because Zellerbach, the owner of Hanzel, had shipped barrels from Burgundy. He wanted to make Burgundy in Sonoma, and it dawned on him that the container must be very important. As far as I know, he was the man who really inaugurated the use of French barrels in California. Well, Joe bought his wines, because I think Zellerbach died. I think his widow sold the wines, and Joe bought, because he recognized, he said, but hey, this Chardonnay just could come from Burgundy. Yeah. And nobody had been able to say that before. What was the difference? It was the barrel.
Very interesting. I mean, Hanzel still does produce incredible wines. Yeah. Their Pinot and Chardonnay in California really owe a debt to Hanzel.
Oh, absolutely.
And in the same way that I believe that Joe Heights, for all of his, attitude problems, I mean, Napa owes a huge debt to him. Well, I mean, no, but you would, I have heard some really amazing stories. I think he was in the business to make good wine, and he wasn't in the business to try to be liked. Yeah. He wanted you to like his wine, and he was going to stop at nothing.
He was, or he wanted you to think he was, a sort of a country bumpkin. Yeah. He didn't like manners and smooth talk. And they're rather Australian style. The Aussies are famous for it.
Really?
Directness. Oh, yes.
Well, that's funny. I like hearing stuff that's not just about bad Americans. That's good. So your impressions of Napa in that time, that era, because I mean, this puts you, what, pre or during the Judgment of Paris time type of a thing?
Oh, way.
Way before.
20 years before.
Oh, wow. Okay. So why don't we have a quick conversation about what your impressions of Napa and California wine were? Because I think the Judgment of Paris is clearly, look, I'll be the first to admit, though I do a lot of it, it's very overblown as far as what it actually was. Yeah. And Stephen would be the first person to say that.
Definitely.
So what were your impressions of California Napa wine? And maybe you can talk about some of the wine you had at the time and what you thought versus what it is today.
Well, I first went to San Francisco when I was a student. I think I was 18 years old, before I went to Cambridge University. And I absolutely fell in love with it. I thought it was the ultimate town. It had a small town atmosphere. It had this freshness and easygoing atmosphere. And there was a coterie of particularly medical men. It's always the doctors and the dentists who have great taste in wine, or in those days collected it, could afford to, and they had amazing cellars. So I was introduced to some of them and tasted treasures such as what I've quoted as wines like the BV or the Martini or one or two other producers of the 1940s and 50s. And that proved to me once and for all that there was a capability of making fabulous. I might as well call it claret. And then, bigger is better is sort of American disease in some cases.
I mean, some would say a disease, others would say strength, but yeah.
Well, strength, alcoholic strength, you bet.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, that one I'm not a... Yes, okay. So keep going.
Well, the winemakers learnt that their market would prefer the wine to be redder and sweeter, above all sweeter, and more alcoholic. So they made it that way. Not all of them, but an awful lot did. And there were some great minds at work in studying what the American palate liked. One of whom was somebody I knew very well, who was Ernest Gallagher. He was a genius. Well, Ernest and Julia, his brother, were geniuses. They used to invite me over to the winery in Modesto and get me to taste a lineup of wines and comment on them. I didn't even charge a fee. And I was so impressed. They would say, here is expensive red Burgundy. This is what we're going to sell as hearty Burgundy. Now you tell us about the difference and the difference in value and everything else. And they were blending some really extraordinary wines. They didn't taste like Burgundy, but my goodness, they were good and good value. And so were they sold a wine called Chablis Blanc.
The American Chablis, yes. I know from my childhood, it was at the bottom shelf in the grocery store in a big jug.
Yeah, and it wasn't that bad. And in fact, it survived conditions that, this is a kind of age of innocence, if you like, when America wasn't all that good at luxury. At certain levels it was. But I stayed in one of the grandest hotels in New York. It was a St. Regis back in the early 60s. A reporter from the New York Post came round and he said, "You're a wine expert. Teach me something about wine." So I said, "Okay, I'll show you a really great white wine from France." So I looked at the wine list and I ordered a Grand Cru Chablis. At the same time, I ordered a Gallo Chablis, and we tasted them together. And the guy said, "Well, why is the French wine so much better?" And I tasted it. It was dark yellow. It was completely oxidized. It had been probably left in a container in the sun on the dock. And a lot of wine in those days with grand labels was just not in good condition. So a lot of people were being misled. And it was better to get a fresh wine in a screw cap bottle from California.
That is interesting. Something that I hadn't really thought about is that French wine in that time just had the unfortunate aspect of having to travel. In my childhood, I really remember Chablis and Hardy Burgundy and all of these things. Yeah. I have not heard somebody speak fondly of these wines near your position ever, frankly. Yeah. I mean, most people, they are just so angry that they ever existed.
Oh, well, that's all wrong. The Gallos did America a great turn in making good wine, and I say it was good wine, available at a low price and selling it. Okay, they gave it a French name, but it was a huge boost for American consumers, in my view. In due course, the consumers matriculated to something maybe better, more authentic, but they would never have tried it if it hadn't been, as you say, on the bottom shelf.
Right, that's true. Yeah, it's true. And I do think every person, myself included, I'm sure you included, you have to start somewhere. Yeah. You can't start, unless you're an investment banker and then somebody gives you a great Bordeaux at a steakhouse, you're generally starting with something, you're in high school or college and you taste something that is probably within your budget.
Yeah, and you should never knock it. If you enjoyed it and you could afford it, that's a really good starting point. And nobody should ever leap to some highly priced wine thinking they're going to get a multiple of pleasure. It doesn't work. The 10 times the price does never mean 10 times the pleasure. You have to bring yourself to the point where you see where the pleasure lies. Okay, it'll be more intensely flavored, it will have more character, but you haven't trained your mind to see that that is where quality lies in wine. So starting at the top just doesn't work.
It's tremendous advice. And I think that too, I don't know if you're on Instagram or social media. I assume you are not, and don't if you aren't. But there's a lot of blowback from people who are called influencers, and they're essentially people who say, in a lot of cases, they are saying, try this New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, it's $10 a bottle. And there's a lot of blowback from people who say, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, yeah. And I think what you are talking about is that people need to be given respect to drink what they understand, like, and can afford.
Absolutely.
I think that's really an important concept.
It is fundamental. If you're unhappy about the price of any wine, then you bought the wrong wine.
Yeah. Just couldn't be more simply put. I could talk to you all day, but I do want to ask you one last major thing. How do you stay so positive and interested in wine over the course of a 60-year career? You don't seem jaded at all.
Well, I always think curiosity is a great gift. If I was able to wish my children or anybody the two greatest gifts they could have for their life, curiosity and a sense of humor. Curiosity just keeps me interested. When I see a label I don't know, I want to get the cork out. That seems to have been the most natural instinct. I'm very lucky to have
it. Yes, I might have to open a cork just after this conversation. It's great. I do find, it's not just in wine, it's in film, it's in any creative endeavor that involves technical aspect as well. People get jaded. They just become tired and they become grumpy. How did you avoid that? I want this to be advice to people who are stuck in a rut, going through lockdown and trying to figure out their lives, putting you on the spot. But
in the simplest possible way, is try something new. You'll get jaded if you do the same thing again. So do something different.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's great advice. So don't always drink the same wine. Don't always go to the same park. Don't always do the same thing. I love it, Hugh.
Although familiarity is a wonderful thing, don't knock it. But still, if you feel bored by something, for heaven's sake, do something else.
Yeah, life's too short.
Yeah.
You have authored, how many books would you say off the top of your head you have written? I mean, I read all the time that you're the most read wine author in the world.
Yeah, but not only a wine author. I wanted to stress that as well, because I reckon I've written about 20 books. I mean, there've been new editions as well. And about 15 of those are about wine, and 5 about gardening and about trees, because I'm equally passionate about those other aspects of nature, which can be beautiful. I now divide my time about half and half between gardening, horticulture generally, and wine. So look for my latest gardening book. It's called Sitting in the Shade, which I love doing.
Wow, interesting. This is great. I think there's a lot of parallels between wine and gardening, honestly.
Yes, I mean, it's people with imagination and taste who are prepared to put effort into cultivating plants to make them as good as they can be. They have that in common.
Yes. Yes. And as far as wine books that you have done, what should people read of yours? Where should they start? I know you're working with the Académie de Vin library now, right?
I am, but a great new addition to the publishing world. It really is. I mean, beautifully produced books, only from good writers, I must say.
You might be biased there, but yeah.
I might.
I'm just kidding, just since you are one of them.
I don't really have a favorite among my books, except because I've become so passionate about history. We've been talking about history. The Story of Wine is, I think it'd be my longest lived book, really.
I couldn't recommend it enough. It is a fantastic book, and one that was foundational in my wanting to continue making films about wine. And history is the answer, in my opinion. So there is no question you need to get that book. If you are listening to this podcast, it is phenomenal. And I agree, it will be. I think that book will live forever. It's timeless.
Well, thank you.
Well, this has been a tremendous pleasure, honestly. I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person here coming up. We're probably going to be in London in December.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's great.
Hopefully we get a chance to clink glasses, and hopefully all this COVID nonsense is behind us, though I don't think it will be.
I fear as well. But it's been a real pleasure meeting you anyway.
Yes. Thank you, sir. We will talk again. All right. Be safe. Thanks, everybody, for listening. You can find me on Twitter at JasonBWise. Please remember, go to SOMMTV.com. We have hundreds and hundreds of hours of content for you wine and food lovers, and much more coming. And do not forget, Eldon Selections is your home for bespoke, small production Burgundy you can find nowhere else. BurgundyWine.com/SOMM. Today's pod was mixed by Alex McCourt and produced by Nadine Netman. We really, really, really appreciate all of you listening. Please don't forget to leave a review somewhere. It means so much to all of us. All right, everybody, be safe. Talk soon.